For all of us that work in public engagement, and some of us are here as commissioners, and some of us are here as practitioners or evaluators, or just those with an interest in interesting and new ways to get people involved in these forward-thinking decisions that affect our lives. One of the critical things that we always think about is what is the impact of what we're doing. You know, it's easy in a way to set up an engagement process with citizens or other stakeholders or people generally, but to really show why it's valuable, why it makes a difference, we need to understand the impact of our work. And Sciencewise as a program is often asked, you know, what difference does it make? Why should we do that? And it's an impact that's very hard to promise, I guess, up front, to kind of say exactly what the impact will consist of. But I think all of us that have been involved in public dialogue know that there are many impacts and many quite nuanced impacts that could do with being unpacked. And so the reason that we've held this seminar today is that we've had the opportunity to look back over a selection of dialogues that Sciencewise has supported and see the kind of differences that they've made and what has enabled the differences to happen, what has enabled the impacts that we see. And so it's a good opportunity to talk about that, and also to launch our report, which looks at the impact of Sciencewise dialogues, and we'll be putting a link to that later in the chat. This is an exciting preview of that report, which will be launched later today, so you get a few hours ahead of the competition on looking at that report. So we will be talking about impacts of Sciencewise dialogues. Susanna will talk about that in a moment. And also then we'll turn to Diane, who will give us a bit of thinking on the crucial ingredients through the life cycle of a project, of a dialogue, that help it create those kinds of impacts. And we'll be taking you through that, and then we'll have a bit of a question and answer session and a discussion. When we come to the questions, please, as you hear the presentations, feel free to drop questions or observations in the chat. That's always good. But also, if you want to just you know, save it for yourself and speak it when we have the question session, please do, and please put up your Zoom hand, probably your Zoom hand better than your real hand, in case I can't see you at the top of the screen. Yeah, that's what we're covering today. The final thing to say, I guess, is that we won't be going into lots of detail today about the mechanics of how do I get Sciencewise support for my public dialogue, how exactly does it work. We can pick up some of the elements in the questions if you like, but we're always more than happy to talk about that offline. And Susanna's email, I think, will probably pop up shortly in the chat for those of you that don't have it, and she will, and you're very free at any time to email Susanna and ask more questions about Sciencewise. So before we jump into the discussion of impacts, I just want to have a brief look at what Sciencewise does, and just to kind of situate what we're doing in that context. So I'm just going to share my screen and slideshow. Hopefully everyone can see that. Someone will let me know if you can't. There we go. So what is Sciencewise? Always a good place to start. It's a programme funded by UKRI, and the aim is to provide evidence on public aspirations and concerns and views and values, everything that sits below perhaps an opinion poll or a more sort of quick and simple way of getting people's first thoughts, the deeper understanding of what people value and their views around new and emerging areas of science and tech and innovation. And also that involves getting views on potential benefits and disadvantages, and it can feed either a research process or a policy making process, or often both. And Sciencewise does this by supporting the commissioning of public dialogue, deliberative public dialogue, to support socially informed and transparent policy and government policy making in research as well. And we do that by bringing together lots of different people, different members of the public, different stakeholders, different actors in these big ecosystems around science, research and policy making, to uncover values and principles, and then really applying these to the complex challenges of the future. And we're pretty good at doing this and have done it for a long time. There have been more than 60 public dialogues since 2004, and there's quite a body of knowledge around what the public think on these future science questions. And what Sciencewise does is it matches funding to government departments who want to do this kind of work. It can give the matched funding of up to 50% to government agencies, to executive non-departmental public bodies, and also bodies that are supported by those bodies themselves. So there are lots of different types of organisations that are supported, and if you email Susanna, she'll tell you whether your organisation is the kind of organisation that fits in with that. And we offer expert support and guidance right from the start, really. So just that kind of scoping, you know, we know these processes don't come out of nowhere. So scoping and putting that preparatory work in place, establishing a business case, applying for funding, and then into the how it's done, forming an oversight group, which is a really important stage of the process, procuring, appointing contractors, delivering and evaluating the project itself, and communicating the results, and then critically, as we're going to talk about today, assessing the impacts. At the moment, there is support for around 5 public dialogues a year, and these are quite, expansive processes that take a long time to deliver in many cases. So 5 public dialogues a year is quite a lot of engagement of this kind. And these could be policy driven or driven by a research agenda. They happen at many different stages. So in framing ideas for research around kind of particular thematic areas, upstream decision making, or much more kind of nuts and bolts downstream implementation decision making. And here are some of the images of some of the dialogue reports that have come out of late. And there's lots more of those on the Sciencewise website that you can take a look at. The current priority themes that UKRI have given Sciencewise to focus on: climate and environment, data, AI and robotics, health, aging and well-being, life sciences and biotech. And those are pretty broad, and they have those questions that you can see on the slide that help to guide us. But I think those really help to crystallise some of the key future questions around how science and tech works with society. And as I said, there's lots on the website, all the supported public dialogue reports and evaluations, lots and lots of insight pulled together across dialogues from thousands of members of the public, hundreds of experts, lots of learning webinars and roundtables. So do have a browse through that website if you don't already know it. And our final slightly cheesy call is to get in touch, because it's in the discussions really, and in the kicking around specific ideas and specific policy and research contexts that it becomes possible to sort of really deliver the value of Sciencewise, that kind of discussion around what we can do. So that was a whistle-stop tour through what Sciencewise does. I can see some of you smiling who know Sciencewise well, and hopefully it's a good start for anyone who doesn't. So I'm now going to hand over to Susanna, who's going to talk about the overview of impacts from the Sciencewise supported public dialogues. What have we seen in our dialogues? So over to you.
Great. Is that all good? You can see that? Yeah? Yeah, great. Thank you. Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for that introduction. And I'm not sure that the end slide was cheesy. I think everybody should get in touch. But hopefully, yeah, that's just the welcome door to come and have a chat if you think that you've got something that Sciencewise can support. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the impacts from Sciencewise supported dialogues. What have we seen? And showcasing the report that we're launching today, which has taken the chance to look across a sample of the public dialogues that Sciencewise has reported and try and kind of extract out some of the impacts from that. So I'm going to go through and pick out a little appetizer to encourage you to go and delve into it more deeply. It's worth saying, I think we touched on that every Sciencewise public dialogue has evaluation that is commissioned alongside it right from the start, but that also, and certainly for the more recent dialogues, 6 months after the dialogue has finished, we go back to the commissioners and say what impact has this dialogue had. 6 months is also not a hugely long period of time, but it's enough to kind of capture the essence of where that impact is happening. And we know that there are kind of both hard and soft impacts that happen way many months beyond that, many years beyond that. And some of the dialogues that I refer to, you know, go back some way as well, and some of them much more recent. Looking across lots of the dialogue, some of the recurrent themes that we see in terms of impacts for commissioners are that there is confidence for policymakers in doing public dialogue, confidence in the route forward that they're taking. You know, on the right-hand side, there's some images of some media that people are trying to probably avoid. So public dialogue enables people to be developing research, to be developing policy that is hopefully not going to attract those sort of positional headlines. So it's giving confidence for policymakers, but also highlighting gaps in their thinking and challenging some of the embedded assumptions. So quite often we hear policymakers going, well, I just hadn't thought of that would be a priority for the public, or I hadn't seen it through that lens. So it's really useful in surfacing that, and enables kind of alignment of that policy, of that research, with societal needs, what the public are expressing as their kind of hopes, fears and aspirations. So bringing the public in as an equal stakeholder to the decision making, to the research process. Sciencewise dialogues kind of flow throughout the whole research and policy cycle, from shaping strategy and agenda setting through to shaping policy and research and delivering and implementation. And within each of those sort of, if we've seen and run dialogues across that whole spectrum, but within each of those, you know, within strategy and agenda setting, looking at dialogues that have looked at funding priorities, or within policy and research, informing legislation or regulation, and within delivery and implementation, for example, guiding criteria and principles. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of cherry pick a few examples to run through. So if we, for example, look at the 2010 genomics medicine dialogue, that was really foundational in terms of informing the national genomics healthcare strategy. So had a really significant input into that strategy. And where we see public dialogues working on national strategy, it's about ensuring that they align with public aspirations or concerns, whether that's a 5-year or a 50-year strategy or plan. When we're looking at agenda setting and strategy within kind of sensitive or controversial research areas, what we have seen there is that public dialogue can take a kind of quite often polarized debate and look beneath that, look beneath those positions, and look at the insight and the richness that you get from public dialogue and the nuance of public views. So back in 2014, this was the public dialogue that was supported on openness and transparency in animal research. Again, foundational in shaping what the public views were on what they expected in terms of openness and transparency, and informed that sectoral concordat on openness in animal research, which to date has kind of about 130 research councils, universities, commercial organisations that sign up to that. So flowing through that expectation into what organisations are doing. If we look to the 2010 synthetic biology dialogue, that was a very upstream look at a new area of technology, but explored what was it, what were the values, what were the principles that underlied the hopes and concerns that the public had for that new area of technology. And we saw that that had catalysed and informed the Research Council's work on responsible innovation. It shaped BBSRC's approach to ethics in grants, as well as really being recognised by some key government select committee and ministerial discussions around the development of that sector over a decade ago. This report actually didn't make this the impacts report that you'll see later, because it finished too late for that. But I just wanted to highlight it as another example. So Genomics England's whole genome screening whole genome sequencing for newborn screening dialogue, which was held in 2021. Again, as we see there from the quote, sort of a bedrock for Genomics England's planning around its newborn genomics pilot research programme. And there was a particular aspect that I thought was worth highlighting, you know, just as an example of the kind of nuance that you get. So one of the things that the public were really concerned about and raised up in that dialogue was around equal access to genetic healthcare information. And that was, again, pivotal in shaping Genomic England's diverse data initiative, which is kind of up and running now. So what we saw there was, you know, again, a highlighting of some key concerns from public participants, and that flowing through into research programs being set up. In the area of development of legislation and research, we have the DFT Connected and Autonomous Vehicles dialogue, which fed into government strategy, and as it says there, as well as the grand challenge on the future of mobility. And again, going back to that confidence point, it's about giving assurance to government that the legislation, that the regulation is being framed and is covering the sorts of issues that are important to the public by hearing and understanding them far more deeply than you would get from that top of mind perspectives from sort of opinion surveys and so on. We've also seen dialogues give advice to wider audiences. So here we see the National Data Guardian dialogue informing new guidance to support those making public benefit evaluations on the use of health and care data. And again, in shaping policy and research, development of guidance papers and advice to government. So the location data dialogue, again, 2021, influencing the Geospatial Commission's guidance and informing the UK geospatial strategy. And turning to sort of delivery and implementation, again, 2021 dialogue on carbon capture, use and storage, shaping the research programme of the UK Industrial Decarbonisation Research and Innovation Centre, but at that delivery and kind of closer to implementation end, ensuring that the range of different impacts on different groups can really be considered in the practice, and giving insight into how those are rolled out both nationally and with local impacts as well. So as well as those specific dialogues and their impacts that they flow through, we see wider impacts from the programme as a whole. We see the strategic direction of research and innovation becoming more aligned with public priorities, that it helps decision makers to navigate that uncertainty and the risks and the uncertainties in their policy areas, that it surfaces new types of governance models and principles to guide the development of science and technology. And we quite often see governance being a kind of central theme that publics want to talk about. What needs to be in place for this technology, for this science to move forward in a way that is trusted and that holds the trust of the public moving forward? What would that look like? As well as giving advice on sort of how to communicate complex issues. What's the narrative? What's the messaging? What flies? What really sticks with people, and what raises sort of flags? And ensuring that that public voice is really heard in policy priorities, in research priorities, and trying to equalise this imbalance that we have in decision making, and ensuring that decisions are sensitive to diverse needs. So when we have our public dialogues, and we can talk about this maybe later, we're not just hearing from the usual suspects in this, we're recruiting and hearing from diverse perspectives and hearing their needs to ensure that there's a much more inclusive approach to policy making. But we've also seen it change the culture of policy making. So those people who are involved as commissioners, as participants in oversight groups, as participants themselves, but particularly the commissioners, we see that completely changing their approach to how they make policy, how they do research, whether that's within their own institutions, or quite often what we see is people might move and take that with their career as well, and onto other organisations. So that was a real whistle-stop tour through some of the impacts to hopefully tantalise you into delving deeper into the report itself, and look forward to having some discussions shortly.
Thanks, Suze. That was great. And I think people have asked in the chat for, will we be showing those slides? I mean, lots of that thinking is in the report that we'll be sharing, but also I think we can share the slides around as well. So that's a nice little taster for you to use. So please do, if you have questions or observations or reflections as you hear what we're saying today, then do put something in the chat, or you can bring up your question shortly. So I'm going to hand over to Diane now, who's going to talk about it's great to get these impacts, but how do we get them? How do we design and run our public dialogue so that they lead us to these positive outcomes? So over to you, Diane.
I will just start to share my screen in a second. Okay, hopefully everybody can see that. Oops. Yep. Okay. So first of all, thank you, Suze. That was an amazing setup. Thank you very much, and it was really comprehensive. So I wanted to just talk about a bit about the sort of ingredients for impact. So how we think about impact in the kind of development, delivery, and communication of a dialogue project. So you'll know we only support projects where there is a clear commitment to findings informing policy development, and as Suze has said, that takes many shapes and forms. And once we finish looking at a project, we continue to track it. I think the website has some projects that we followed up something like 5 years after the dialogue had concluded, and whilst it's obviously very hard to track the absolute certainty of that relationship, people do talk a lot about the dialogues in which they've been involved, and as Sue said, it changes the culture of policy making. So each dialogue is evaluated independently, and the dialogue evaluator works alongside the delivery team and the commissioner. And my view of impacts is that they're not the responsibility of a single owner. Everybody involved in a project can play a positive part and has responsibility for making sure that a project has those impacts. The evaluators are very good at asking the appropriate questions at the appropriate time during the delivery of a dialogue, and the evaluations are both formative and summative. So they will ask, they're very experienced, a lot of our evaluators, and they understand dialogue and what makes the dialogue work. So they play a crucial role, and I think often are lauded in the sort of dialogue sphere. So in I think 2016, recognizing that a dialogue that has impacts has to have credibility. So it needs to be recognized as rigorous, it needs to be recognized as sort of comprehensive, relevant, accessible, legal, and ethical. And so in 2016, we developed a Sciencewise quality framework, which we updated during the pandemic to reflect the fact that we all went online and processes changed. And the framework essentially tracks the various stages of a project. So right from context to scope and design to delivery, impact, and how the evaluation happens. I'm going to talk you through what happens or what we focus on at each stage to help ensure that impacts are realised. So context, that means things like, is this dialogue happening at the right time? So is it too late for a dialogue to be done and dusted with a sufficient quality to impact on the things that we would like it to impact upon? How are the results going to inform policy and research? So impacts are not straightforward. There's a tendency for findings to go into a black box, and you're never quite sure exactly how those findings influenced thinking. And it's, as I said before, that causal link is problematic, to say the least. But there has to be sufficient time to deliver a quality dialogue. We also ask about the kind of boundaries of influence. So we ask commissioners to give us clarity about the level of influence, the extent of influence. Is this going to be far upstream, like the synthetic biology dialogue, where it's really impossible to give any sort of determinate case of how this dialogue is going to impact on a specific policy, but it's kind of far upstream, so it will have it will set a framework perhaps for future public dialogue, or it will open up questions for future research. So we ask about the extent of influence. We ask also about what else has happened in this space. Has there been previous dialogue? Are you building on something that we already know, or are you just duplicating questions? And this context setting is where we have those really detailed conversations with the commissioners as they develop their business case. So we constantly ask them, what is the impact? How is this going to work? Will the objectives help you achieve the impact? And we often, in fact, probably always include, and one of the dialogue objectives is around the impact. So when we think of dialogue, we don't just think of the delivery element, we think of the whole gamut. So moving on to scope and design. So this takes off from the context, obviously, the boundaries of influence. So what can we talk to people about? So how do we scope this dialogue so that we give people sufficient information, but not too much? Because if we overwhelm people, they get kind of headaches, and the findings are not clear. So it's really important that we manage the quantity of information and the quality of information that we give to people during a dialogue. Who's going to be involved? Sue's mentioned the specific interest groups. So if you're doing a dialogue on health, for example, are there particular groups of people who might be impacted by the findings? If you're doing a dialogue on data, are there particular groups within society who might have a different relationship to data, digital identity, for example, than other groups? So making sure that you're including the right people in your dialogue, and that includes both public participants, but it also includes stakeholders. So who are your specialists? Have you got the right kinds of specialists? Are they able to speak to the general public, or are they lost in small charts and tables and data, to the extent that they're not able to communicate the main points of their presentation? Will the design deliver the objectives that are set for the dialogue? And also, and importantly, what are the ethical questions? How are you going to gain consent? How are you going to ensure that consent is ongoing during a dialogue? what's the level of consent you need? Most of our work does not involve academic ethics boards, but that nonetheless we need to make sure that ethics are considered, well considered in any dialogue. Delivery is where I guess the dialogue contractor comes to the fore, and all the work that everybody else has done to support them as they have designed a project. So delivery has to be fair and it has to be balanced. It has to have the people in the room that we said were going to be in the room. It has to be respectful. So we do not want to waste people's time. And this is obviously related to impacts. People want to know that their involvement will have an effect in the world. Time is important again. There has to be sufficient time for reflection and deliberation, for people to recycle back to things that they have had a discussion about previously in the light of new information. Delivery also involves things like data capture. So how are you going to capture people's thoughts? At what level of detail? So are you going to record? Are you just going to take notes? Are you going to rely on post-it notes? And each form of data capture will lead to a different type of reporting. And obviously reporting is the report is the document to which the policymakers have access. So you need to think about what level of data capture do we need in order to have the impacts that we wish. Analysis and reporting, clearly crucial. Are you just going to say this happened, then this happened, then this happened, and then people thought this? Or are you going to do a much more sophisticated analysis of your findings where you're situating the findings within a wider context, for example, which is obviously preferred. And finally, dissemination and communication, which are crucial. Impact, Suze has talked about that a lot. I guess one of the first questions we ask is, has this met the objectives and critical success factors which the evaluator will be looking for? How credible is the dialogue to target audiences? How are the findings going to be disseminated? And on whom are the impacts felt? And what unanticipated impacts? Often dialogues have impacts that we just didn't consider in the first place. And then evaluation, I've talked a little bit about evaluation. It needs to have a clear scope. It needs to have critical success factors built into it. They tend to draw on the quality framework as a basis for developing an analytical framework. Evaluations have to be evidence-based, but also reflective. As I said, the evaluators are often very experienced, so their reflections are incredibly useful. But there are two things which I think are absolutely crucial. So, whoops. The first is governance, and the second is communication. So governance essentially means the oversight group. So for every project, we put together an oversight group which reflects hopefully the full range of debate on a particular topic. Not only the full range of debate, but also the sectoral interests. So we policy, NGOs, campaigning organisations, academics, industry, for example. So really making sure that the debate can happen in the room, and those different perspectives inform the setup, the delivery of a dialogue, all the materials that are involved, and the we often have very senior people on our oversight groups, so they have excellent networks through which to disseminate the findings of a project. So they're really important when it comes to impacts. They provide the seniority and the mix of different perspectives provides us with security, but it also provides audiences with a demonstration of the integrity and credibility of a dialogue. Communication is also important. Communication throughout, not just to the outside world, but thinking about who is your audience. What do we want to say to them about this particular project? At what stage do we want to say something? Do we want to say something again in 6 months' time, for example, or 3 years' time? And we have a wonderful comms team now in Sciencewise, so they will pick up that, but we also want to make sure that contractors, evaluators, the commissioner are all joined up in the messages that we want to give. Finally, I'm just going to skip the next slide. Okay, finally, passing on learning. So at the end of every project, we have a wash-up meeting, which involves everybody except for the oversight group, but the evaluator will have talked to the oversight group. And we pass on learning. So we make sure from every project that we learn what went well, what didn't go well, what are the impacts to date, how can we help to maximize those, and we feed on that learning into future projects so that we really make sure that we build and improve and get better at making sure that Sciencewise dialogues have impacts. And that's everything from me, so thank you all very much.